Hello students, in this session you will learn the basics of Entity Framework. Entity Framework is one of the amazing features were added to the .NET Framework. It makes the development more easier. Simply, the Entity Framework allows you to deal with the database using the concept of the object-oriented programming. As I explained before, the concept of the object-oriented programming, so now it's more easy to understand the Entity Framework. First of all, let's understand what do we mean by entity. Simply, entity means a table in the database. And as I explained in the SQL session, what is the table and what is the component of the table in the database. So now we can just say that the entity is just a table in the database. But we will deal with this table using C#. We have two types in the Entity Framework. The first called Code First and the second called DB First. Code First means that we will start creating and building everything by the code, while DB First, it means that we have an existing database and we need to use it in our Entity Framework. In this session, we will just focus on the Code First approach. We said that the entity is just a table. So now how we can create an entity using the C# code and translate this entity into a table in the SQL database. We know now the classes. So every class will represent an entity. And inside this class, we should write our properties. And these properties will be mapped into a fields or columns in the database. So we know that the table contains a columns. So now in Entity Framework, the class represents the table and the properties, which is like this ID, name, or is active, this will represent the column. And the data type here, like integer, string, boolean, will be translated into the corresponding data type in the SQL database. Like the integer will be integer, and the string will be like varchar, and the boolean will be the pet. So by this way, we can create the entity. Like here we have the teacher entity, represents teacher table, and it contains these columns, ID, name, active, and these are the data types for these columns. Now, before going to the Visual Studio to take an examples for the Entity Framework, we need to focus on some of the main features in Entity Framework. I said that we can create entities using C# and translate these entities into the database. But this is not only the thing that we can do using Entity Framework. We can also do data operations or data manipulations using Entity Framework. Like Entity Framework actually executes insert, update, and delete commands to the database. So we can insert data, we can update data, and we can delete data using Entity Framework based on the changes occurred to your entity. So any changes will happen in your entity or in your table will be tracked and will be reflected to the database, and this will be done when you call the method save changes. And save changes, this we will see this how it works by an example. And also one of the most important features in Entity Framework is LINQ, which is called link or LINQ. LINQ allows us to deal with the database using the C# language. We explained before how to retrieve, for example, data from SQL server using SQL command, like it was select star from your table. Using LINQ or link, you can write this query using C# language, but we will not write it like select star from your table. We will write it in a different format. This format will be translated into an actual SQL command. So we will write a C# code, and this C# code will be translated into a query, SQL query, using the database provider in the Entity Framework. And we will see how this works.